Hi, that was pretty awesome, and everything she says is totally true. Yes.
Yes.
So, yeah, I guess I could tell you a little bit about me and the clown class refugee thing, because it sort of goes into how I wound up being a novelist and an illustrator, most of it accidentally, which I think is honestly the best way to do things. So I didn't start out as a writer, I started out as an actor. And I went to NYU and studied at their experimental theater wing, which means I have the most useless degree in the world. I have a BFA in experimental theater and English literature, which means I can ask you if you want fries without using interpretive dance. So it's completely useless. But I found as I was progressing through my acting program, I was becoming more and more in love with words, and not just wanting to say other people's words, but have people saying my words. It was sort of a control thing. So I found myself starting to write plays instead. So I left acting school, a playwright. And then I got a really big idea, and I thought, oh, well, maybe this is a play. And I started it, and it didn't feel like a play. I said, all right, well, maybe it's a short story. And I started it, and it got bigger than a short story. I said, okay, well, I'm writing a novella. And then it was bigger than a novella. And I finally admitted to myself, like 2 years in, that I was writing a novel, and it was going to take me a really long time. So it took about, I would say, on and off 10 years to write the book of speculation, because I think I was too young when I started it, and by the time I finished it, I was good and ready to be done. So yeah, it took a lot of time and effort. But while I was in acting school, I got really fascinated with circus arts, and I was in this program that let you do all sorts of wonderful things, like take clowning class. And there was no way I was not going to take clowning class. Like, there's nowhere else I know that you can study it. So I did, and I was really terrible at it. And I discovered that the worst feeling in the world is knowing that you must be funny on demand and that you are completely incapable of being so. I never cried more in my life than I cried in clowning class in front of other people. And consequently, I have pretty much no fear now because I've already been humiliated to the nth degree. So that was a terrifying experience, but also a really freeing one for me. And also introduced me into the world of circus arts. And I also at the time discovered that my speech teacher during the summers toured as a ringmaster in a traveling circus called the Circus Flora. Flora is their elephant. And I didn't understand until that moment that you could actually run away with a circus. It is a viable career option, and I was stupid enough to have not known that, and I regret that for the rest of my life. But yeah, so she had this wonderful job, and she exposed me to this sense of family and adventure, and that you could just have this other world that you could escape to, and that was something that was infinitely appealing to me. And so when I sat down to write my really big idea, it happens to revolve a lot around circus. So I'm gonna ask, how many of you have read this book like the whole way through, hands up? Cool. All right, so I'm trying to figure out who and what I won't spoil things because I saw some hands down, and no shame if you haven't finished it, but now I know a little bit about what I can and can't talk about. So this is a dual narrative, and it's a little bit difficult to explain because there's a lot going on. So I find the easiest way to explain this book is to say that it is, in simple terms of plot, a man versus his house versus the sea versus his sister versus a curse. And that's pretty much how it all winds up together. And it's 250 years of family's history. Half of it is in the 1790s, half of it is the modern day, and half of it sort of takes place in a library around here. And people often ask me, well, why libraries? And I'd say, well, you're gonna ask a writer that? If you ask any writer, we say inevitably that libraries saved our lives, and that was very true for me. And when I sat down to write a big project that I knew I was gonna take a really long time, I knew that it had to be something that I was obsessed with. So that became circus, it became books, and it became the area where I grew up. And I think you guys know, living here, how very special Long Island is and how it's not very much like the rest of the country views it. As I've toured around, I find people tend to think of Long Island as being like a New York City junior or something like New Jersey. And I'm like, no, not at all. So I wanted to write about towns in the area where I grew up because I felt they were very unique and at the same time really fragile. I think people in Long Island know, especially after Hurricane Sandy, how quickly things are changing and how very fast this land is going. So it felt important to me to write about the place where I grew up and how I remembered it and how it is now. And so it would be around in some format in the future for other people to find. And what I'm discovering is that I actually wrote a small town everywhere. People in Arizona have glommed onto this little town of Nepauset, and they find it very relatable. And so what I thought was a very local book became, in some ways, a very universal book. So that was interesting and fun for me. I also find that people are interested in how on earth a writer gets published and what happened with this particular novel. And if you have a paperback, there is a small essay about that in the back, and you can see some crazy pictures, but it's why I brought this thing with me. So what this is the book from the Book of Speculation. At the heart of the story is a very old circus log that my protagonist, Simon, receives mysteriously one day. It has his grandmother's name written in it. And it becomes this enormous plot point for him because it's this object that is irresistible, and it draws him in, and it pulls him into this family history where he discovers this drowning curse. So to really buy into the story, to understand the book, you have to be in love with an object. You have to find a book so seductive that it could derail your entire life. And I thought, well, if I can show that to an editor and they can fall in love with this physical object, there's a really good chance they'll fall in love with the story. So I made the book. My manuscripts were sent out exactly like this, which is hand-bound. It uses leather, Indian leatherite crinkle is the name of the paper that I used for the cover. I wound up tea staining the edges of all the pages and aging them with a rasp. I wanted to include the illustrations that are later in the book because one of my characters draws. So I started drawing things and tea staining them and tucking them into pages. And a tarot deck features heavily in the book. So I said, well, wouldn't it be nice if they could experience that as well? So I took a Rider-Waite tarot deck and I sanded down the edges and started staining it with coffee and making these cards really old, which was a really strange sort of creepy experience because you do feel a little odd, as you're sanding down the death card and whatnot. So if there is a way to actually get bad juju from that, I'm sure I got it. So I tucked those in the pages, and I found a font online that was called 1786 GLC Fournier, which I remember because I was trying to look for period-accurate fonts that would look like things that were printed on broadsides at the time, so that you could believe that this was an old object, but at the same time it would still be easy to read. So I kind of went a little crazy, in case you can't tell. I made 16 of these. Over the course of the summer, my dining room turned into a book bindery. I'm still married, which is, I have a very forgiving husband, or just too scared to actually interrupt me. But it became a complete and total labor of love. I knew that I had worked on this book for so long that if I didn't throw every ounce of my being into trying to get it out there, I would always wonder if I had ever done enough. And I knew that if I had sent this out and nothing ever came of it, I would at least have something I could keep that was an art object to say, you finished this thing, you did this thing, and this is yours. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend people do that, but I think that's the way I really like to approach books and literature in general. Wholeheartedly, no holds barred, just books are my life and the story will be my life, and we'll just go from there and see what comes of it. So I sent this thing out with my agent, and she sent out on a flash drive because apparently you can't just send things hard copy anymore. You have to have some sort of digital thing. But the flash drive was a little message in a bottle, and we sent it with a letter from my antiquarian bookseller, who is in this book, Martin Churchwary. And I sat and I sweated. And most of the time when you send out books to see if editors would like to buy them, you sit for a couple months, sometimes a year. I sold the book in 4 days because it worked. Because the universal thing with book lovers is a book is a seductive object. The hardcover is a seductive object. The pages are a tactile pleasure. And so I found my editor, and we had a wonderful phone call, and she said, "Oh, you sent me that beautiful book." And I said, "Oh, and we're gonna make a beautiful book together." And we did. And here comes the part about me being the accidental illustrator. So I didn't realize I was actually going to illustrate this book until it was announced in Publishers Weekly, which is a hard way to find out that you have a lot of work to do. But yeah, the announcement came out in Publishers Weekly, and they said, "Oh, you know, they purchased this hand-bound book, and it's illustrated, and whatever." And I said, "Oh, that's nice. I wonder who they're going to get to illustrate it." And I said, "Oh, well, you're doing it." So some of the drawings that you see in here went out with the initial manuscript, and others were made specifically for the book itself. And they are not necessarily how I actually draw in my everyday life. They are me drawing as Hermelius Peabody, a 1790s circus master who is sketching on the road. So I wanted to find a way to make illustrations that looked as though they were almost like woodcuts. So they're highly stylized, and they're very particular to Peabody's taste. So that's how those came about. But I was really excited about having the illustrations in eventually, because it becomes another way for people to engage with books. I haven't seen illustrations in adult novels in years, and I think it's a complete and total shame, because they make children's literature, they make young adult literature so lively, and they really engage a reader on a different level. So I was very excited to see that I could pull an adult reader in this way and just give them another piece of this world. So that's how I like to approach fiction, is by pulling people in through different ways. So that's sort of the story of my publication. But it's basically also the story of my love for books and how I got here. So that's the very basic tale of this. Some other things I've noticed about books and things that keep coming up, people often want to know about the tarot cards and how on earth I got, into them, and how much I know about them, and why does this pop in the story that way. And it also started because I'm fascinated with language. So, and also because I was in college and I was a drama student, and like most college drama students, I was really lost in looking for answers in the universe, and I thought tarot cards might have them, and they didn't. But it was a really fun time I taught myself how to read cards, and I did lots of readings for my friends, and we were always very sure that they were always right, because the wonder of tarot cards is they are completely symbolic, so you can read anything that you want to in them, so they are always right. So, but I read for a number of years just for fun and for myself, and when it came time to write this character of Amos, who is a mute in the 1790s struggling to communicate, it seemed like a really natural way to give him language, because language itself is nothing but symbols. Each word I say represents an idea, not an actual thing. So, and tarot works the very same way. So working in a time when there is no standard American Sign Language, and working with people who wouldn't know it anyway, it seemed the most handy and at the same time beautiful way to develop a language that's just as layered as any speech. So that's how I got through tarot from that. And also it's a nice tool because people read so much into cards anyway. Like I say I'm using tarot, and you immediately have thoughts in your mind, oh, fortune tellers, this and that. And it's a lot of fun to play with assumptions and turn them sideways. So consequently, I can no longer read tarot for myself, because I think of it as a language, and one that I spent a long time trying to figure out meanings for. But at the same time, I did give myself another language. So I encourage you, when you're reading and you're thinking about this, to think about how language actually works and the layers of meaning each word has, because that's ultimately most of the plot of this book is through misunderstandings and misinterpretations of language, even though there's also this very dramatic house thing going on. So a little bit about the house in this book. If you've ever walked along Long Island's North Shore, which at some point you must have, there are houses right up on the bluffs. So again, people in the center of the country were assured, what? How does that happen? No, we just build there, it's pretty, it's fine. But yeah, so I always wondered when I was, walking along the beaches and I was little, like, who lives in those houses? How do they get that way? What are they going to do to keep them from falling over? And how could you possibly just be in there? And so that had been a thought that had been living in my mind for many years, and I finally got to use it, and a house became a plot device. And I like to think of the house as if you've ever seen Little Miss Sunshine, and you know how the van kind of becomes its own character, I wanted a house to be that way, because a house has so much symbolism as it is, because it contains your family, puts so much of your life into it, that it needed to have its own personality, and it needed to, at sometimes, have malicious intent. So I wanted to have a place that was in danger and dangerous and beloved at the same time. So I have this house that's sitting on a cliff. And also gives a nice little bit of, I want to say, geology and the environment as plot, which if you live on the seashore should be pretty important to you. I think land management is something people don't necessarily get in other parts of the country. But we are basically on geologic timeline here. There is erosion happening and the house has a certain amount of time left. So that was a nice plot device, and I just got to write water doing what it does, and at the same time it forces the plot along. So we've got a house, we've got tarot cards, we've got a mute in a circus in the 1790s, and we also have circus mermaids, which a lot of people I find are very interested about the mermaids as I write them and how they wind up in the circus and where that came from. So I'm very fascinated with free diving, and that's people who hold their breath for an extended amount of time, and there are contests to see who can hold the longest and go the deepest, and pearl divers are absolutely amazing, can hold their breath for like 9 minutes. So as far out as some of this seems, it's actually much closer to reality than people realize, and it's an incredibly beautiful sport that is also an art form. So that's sort of where my fascination with it started. But it was also a really interesting way for me to explore myth. I discovered as I was researching that every country has its own water spirit, whether it's mermaids, selkies, nixies, rusalka. There are all these different iterations of this same myth, and I wanted to find out what that would look like in the US. And as far as circus and carnival and sideshow as we think of it, they're very distinctly American art forms, what we think of it. So blending those two felt really natural for me. And it also got me in a place where I could write really opinionated, tragic, beautiful women at the same time, and that's a lot of fun. So I think those are some of the basic things that people tend to like to ask me about, and some of the things that I enjoy about the book myself. But I guess ultimately, the thing that I like to drive home about this book is that it crosses a lot of genres. And that is ultimately, I think, what really good fiction should do. It should pull from different areas. I've seen this book sorted under mystery, thriller, romance, sci-fi, fantasy, literary fiction, family saga, and there's something else I'm forgetting. But it is, in fact, all of those things. And when people ask me, well, what type of book is it? I say, well, it's a book, and it does book things. And I think ultimately that's what we should ask of our fiction, to tell a good story, to pull from all of the databases of books that there are out there, and to make something that speaks to all of us. So I hope that's what you're looking for when you're reading, and I hope I can keep trying to break that for you. So I'm happy to take any questions, all of it. And I will definitely try not to spoil anything, and if I do, I'll lie. Say Yes?
You may have referenced this, I don't recall, but how did you come to name Simon's sister what you did?
Enola? Yeah. So I wanted a really loaded name, and also there is, in the paperback, you will see there's a short story called The Mermaid Girl, and it's from the perspective of Simon's parents, who are in the book, but not, not alive at the time. And I noticed a trend in parents wanting to name their children something that meant something, to like reclaim a name or give their child hope. And I thought it seemed like something Paulina would do. She was trying to make a statement and trying to reclaim a name. And so, yes, she is Enola, and most people immediately think of the Enola Gay. And some people trying to be clever say, oh, when you spell it backwards and it's alone, and there are layers for that. So, but I also wanted a character who, when she walked on the page, you would immediately think that she was a bomb. And she is. The second she shows up on the page, things start to happen, and they spiral out of control really quickly. So with a name like Enola, there's no avoiding that. And I invite people to add layers to that. I think it adds a little something to the reading for them. Yeah. Thank you.
Where on the North Shore did you grow up?
Oh, I don't like to be too specific just because I
That's
feel like,
fine.
no, I feel like it ruins it for people, but I grew up around Port Jefferson.
Okay.
But so when you read the ferry, you'll probably picture the Port Jeff ferry. But I tried to pull from a bunch of different places. So yeah,
I thought
like,
it was Rocky Point.
yeah, well, Rocky Point's in there, I mentioned it.
No, I know.
Oh, yeah, so I tried to pull from little towns to sort of make all the surrounding towns to make this kind of area. And then I also borrowed part of the Brooklyn Public Library as far as their organization, and then some of Comsuag, and like all the different libraries I've been to are in there in some aspect. And then there are different, it's funny, people ask me specifically, where are you from? Can I go there? And I say, well, you could try, but you get really lost because I put roads in from different towns. So if you try and drive it, you'll wind up in the water, which is kind of appropriate. Yeah. Yes.
I like how you use the horseshoe crabs in the story.
Right.
Did you have any experiences with horseshoe
I
crabs?
did, right. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I forgot to talk about the horseshoe crabs because they're so normal to me, but everybody else. Yeah, so horseshoe crabs are a huge part in this book, and people from around here get what they are, people west not so much. But yeah, so what started this idea of using horseshoe crabs was actually a date I went on with my husband like a million years ago when we were first just young and cute and had just met each other. We snuck out of work one night, and we were walking along the beach in Port Jefferson, and it was the middle of July, and all of these horseshoe crabs were up on shore. We had no idea what they were doing, and it was like, hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands. And I had never seen, you see like one or two a week maybe, just when they're not doing so well, but they were all up on the shore, lined up like stones, and they were piling on each other too. And I didn't realize they were mating. I had to research this to figure out what was going on. But it was one of the most visually striking things I've ever seen in my life. And again, I didn't know what I was going to use it for, but and I was trying for years and years to find a place where that fit in like theater and plays and short stories until I found this. Oh, okay, well that's why I saw that, and this is what I have to use it for. And I'm surprised PETA hasn't gotten on me because I'm kind of mean to them. They're sort of evil in the book, but or they come across that way, but I didn't intend it that way. So when I talk about the different times that are going on in this book, I want you to think of it this way. Simon has a month to do something, but we're dealing with a curse that is 250 years old in a house that has essentially been doomed to go under since Long Island was left. And then there are these creatures that are even older than that. Like Simon talks at one point in time about how they're unchanged since they came into being. So I wanted to have this level of overarching time so you could have an understanding of how small and how small one life is and how small 250 years is. But at the same time, it's all part of the same history. So I wanted to have that kind of element. And I also like to play with the idea that since they've been around so long, they probably know more than we do about the earth and how it changes and how we change and how very temporary all of this is. And so I like to think of them as the little patient editors correcting things as they go. So that's a little level for me that makes me happy. But it was very important for me to have them in there, and it started with just this one very striking thing I saw. And I sort of think of them as, in some ways, the caretakers. And that's what I will say to PETA when they finally contact me. But yeah, no, they're wonderful creatures, and I love them desperately. And I think I tend to do terrible things in fiction to things I love an awful lot, like libraries. Yeah, libraries don't fare so well in this book, but that's because I love them. Yes.
So I was thinking about the character Enola, and you were talking about the name, and about how long it took you to write the book.
Yep.
So obviously you put it aside and went back to it and
Oh,
all
yeah.
of this. Many times probably.
Uh-huh.
So did you start out with like the whole plot kind of figured out, or you had
Half of
some
it.
piece, and then as you went it changed, and
Yeah.
like Enola, did you have that name and then put a character to fit the name, or the other way around?
Enola was always Enola. And she
Okay.
was always exactly like she is. She had different, she actually started as one of the narrators. There were initially, oh gosh, this has been through so many iterations, but there were initially 4 books in this one book, and each one had a different narrator, and she was one of them. And it was so disjointed, but it's what you have to do for a first draft. She was always who she is. She was born fully formed, as they say. But I would say the 1790s storyline with Amos and Evangeline was with me from the beginning. It came to me in about 30 seconds while taking a bath, which is like one of those ridiculous moments of inspiration that you don't think ever happens, and then there it happens to you, and I'm waiting for another one. But yeah, I took a great bath. 30 seconds it all came. I had to shut off the water, get out. I was crying. I sat down, I wrote 30 pages, and those 30 pages are still in here. So, and they were like the least edited part of the whole thing. So I sort of feel like that was the purest creative impulse I've ever had. But yeah, it took a long time to figure out how they all blended together and how exactly these 2 stories fit. I knew there were 2 parts of the same story, but I wasn't quite sure where the overlaps would happen. Simon's name changed. He started as David. Frank was initially Walt. Like, names changed like that. Amos was always Amos.
But why would you change like David to Simon? What would be your thinking on that?
After what, it sort of becomes, it changes when you go through drafts, and it helps you just get rid of old writing. And also, at a certain point, you wind up in naming trenches. Like, I had Daniel and David, and I had a whole bunch of D names. And I said, this is going to be confusing for a reader, and it's confusing for me. And then you wind up going through like baby books for name meetings. I said, no, it's terrible. And we all do it. I mean, and then at a certain point in time when you're doing things when you're doing things in a historical period, you're like, everyone hits the same database. Like, okay, what were the popular names in 1882? And, you know, but you just wind up with names that at a certain point feel very comfortable for you. And Simon felt like, it felt like it was his personality in a name, if that makes any sense. It may not to other people, but to me that was his name. And when I landed, I said, oh gosh, he was never David. That was so wrong. That's why I couldn't write this book. David. But yeah, so it switches a lot. And people ask a lot about, oh, like endings. The ending has changed like 80 different times. I think.
It's hard, the ending.
Yeah, and I mean, and the ending I know for myself is not the one that's in the book, because you always have to figure out what serves the story for when it's out in the world and how people are going to receive it. And it's nice then, because I have a little private story for myself that way. So yeah, there have been like so many different endings that when you talk to an editor, when you sign a book deal, they immediately start telling you things they want to change, and that's how you figure out who you want to work with, what you're okay with changing and what you're not. My editor said, oh, I want to change the ending. I said, sure. I've been through it 1,000,000 times anyway. So yeah, that's the thing that changes the most. But I think by the time I had sold the book, I was probably on my 12th draft at least. But it takes a long time to really find the spirit of the book, especially when you don't start out thinking that you're writing a novel.
Mm-hmm.
I had to teach myself how to write, basically. Yeah. So yeah, it's a lot of work, but it was good. It was worth it. Yes.
The Enola's boyfriend, how,
Doyle?
whatever gave you the idea of making him that type of character?
Okay, so this is, and oh, I miss him terribly already, David Bowie. I saw Labyrinth when I was really little, and he would contact juggle. He contact juggled these, crystal balls in it, excuse me. And if you've ever seen someone contact juggling, it's fascinating. So I wanted that, and I wanted to pull in some sideshow elements, and a very famous sideshow element are, the electric girls and electric boys, and they basically conduct electricity and take voltage from an electric chair, and it's sort of an Uncle Fester trick from the Addams Family. So it has a lot of sideshow and carnival history in that sense, and it's also quite menacing. And I wanted a character to show up who you were primed to dislike from the beginning, but then fall in love with. I think that is interesting for a reader, it's interesting for a writer, and I also like playing with characters who look quite scary, but then are very tenderhearted. And a full body tattoo is sort of the most visually arresting way I could do it, and it's also a really fun thing to write in the sense that it's like writing water. You know, you get to write a creature and a person at the same time. And so that was fun for me. And he was also a calming presence because Simon in its own way is very obsessive and Enola is incredibly manic. And so he needed a calm center. And I thought to put a calm center in someone who was so visually disturbing was fun for me and it would be interesting for a reader. And I think he became sort of a kind center. He's the one that people talk to me the most about and say, oh, what is Doyle doing? Are you ever gonna write anything else with them? To which I say, not at this point, just because like following Doyle around would sort of be like on the road again. You know, he's sort of it's been done, he's sort of a Dharma bum, and there's not a lot of plot for someone who is always happy wherever he lands. So I think he serves his purpose as a supporting role and as a calming element for an otherwise rough book. So, yeah, but he was fun to write. People often ask me, like, you know, how do you come up with characters, or are they people you know, or people you know in this book? He's the only person I directly drew from anyone in my real life, and it's just one element. He sounds exactly like my friend Steve to me. So, and my friend Steve did not know this until I said this at a book talk. He was like, but yeah, so every time I was writing Doyle's dialogue, I was hearing my friend Steve's voice delivering it, going, dude, totally. So, yeah. So it was interesting to also hear the audiobook and someone else's take on that. And I said, yeah, that's right too. But yeah, that's the only element I really ever took from somebody directly. I'd say otherwise, as far as making characters, yeah, you borrow elements from people you know, but never a whole person. You just you take someone's hand, or you know, a nose or something like that. Literally physical things, the delivery of a line or a voice, but it's never just a person from whole cloth that way. I think people often ask fiction writers in particular, like, is this from your hometown? Is this life? Is this your life? Did you actually do this thing? And to which the answer is always yes and no, not at all. You can't write anything that you haven't experienced in some way indirectly, just because you're always drawn from because you're drawing from emotion, and you can't write emotion that you haven't experienced. So yes, in some ways it's always autobiographical, but at the same point in time, it's never lifted directly from anything unless you're being a very lazy writer. So while things may feel familiar as far as, you know, towns around here because you're from an area, like I said, if you try and drive it, you wind up in the water. So that's sort of how fiction works. So. Anybody else?
So how many minutes can you hold your breath underwater?
So
you said you gather it from experience.
Yeah,
so.
the last time I checked, it was around 2 minutes, which was great because I hadn't done it in a while. The longest I could hold it was years ago, and that was when I was playing oboe and my lungs were good. But yeah, no, the last time I checked was, I would say, about a year ago, and it was around 2 minutes. But yeah, that's where I get the lightheadedness from, and like being underwater and looking up and all that. Yeah, so I tried it.
Are you working on anything?
I am. I'm working on something very different, which is exciting to me. I'm working in a cross between magical realism and STEM, as we're calling it now, science, technology, engineering, and math. I have a character of a little girl in 1986 Florida, and she's just seen the Challenger explode and her dreams along with it. So I'm moving along with that, and the elements of the book include playing around with time and stopping it, but just in a very localized area, like, say, a person.
So you're a committed fiction writer now?
I am, at this point in time, a committed fiction writer. Yeah. So we'll see how this goes, but it's exciting. It's a very different feel for me, but I'm really enjoying it. And as far as when I talk to people about what I'm writing, the response has been like, okay, yeah. So that's been the most wonderful thing about this whole process, is meeting people who are willing to let me take them somewhere weird and different. I would say my favorite books are dark, smart, and weird, and that's what I'm trying to do. And I hope you guys are along for dark, smart, and weird, because that's it.
How do you choose the name for a book? The name you chose?
Oh, no, this one, oh God, this one's funny. Yeah, so I'm the worst person at titles ever. I just got off the phone with my editor before, and she's like, yeah, no, that doesn't work. I'm like, no, it really doesn't. But this started as a joke, because it took me so long to write. I was speculating that I would ever finish it, so I saved the file as the book of speculation, assuming that it would get changed, and it never did. So, and as we were going along editing, it became more and more about this book that was a book of speculation, and speculating about history and speculating about books themselves. And so it grew to fit this title that I started as a joke, but yeah, no, my editor doesn't even know that. Yeah, so sometimes the joke titles are the ones that stick, but most of the time when you're hunting for titles, it's just long lists of things that are completely unacceptable. And I think the movie Julia and Julia does it well, where there's just a big idea board of things and you're circling words and trying to mash stuff together. I think the best titles come out of things that way. I have no art for that at all, and I am thankful anytime anyone volunteers to do it for me. Yes?
You said it took you, 10 years to go with speculation. During that time, were you also thinking of your next book, or do you just go this far, finish, focus on this, and then
I am
start
a
thinking?
very distracted individual. It's really hard for me to focus on one thing only at a time, and especially because I didn't really know how to write a novel. So I was writing short stories at the same time, figuring that it would teach me how to write plot, and it did. And it would also help me get my name out there, and it did. And I was also working, because you have to have a job if you're an unpaid unpublished novelist. So yeah, while this was all going on and I was writing other things and thinking of other ideas, like I have about 6 fledgling ideas that at some point I will get to before I die, hopefully. But yeah, they all kind of float back in there. But at that time I was also, let's see, I was a secretary, I sold hotel and convention space, I proofread funeral programs and prayer cards, I was a legal transcriptionist, I was an assistant to a potter in Brooklyn. What else did I do? Yeah, so I collected life while I was writing. And I also helped put my husband through medical school, so he's paying me back now. But yeah, I think the best books come from life having been lived during the writing. So, because you just draw from experience and it all winds up on the page, whether you want it to or not. So that's how that happened. And the short stories wound up being essential for this entire process, because I had some published online, and I had queried my agent, I would say, I don't know, several years back, and I had received an immediate form rejection. And then she found, like 2 years later, one of my short stories online. And she said, oh, do you have a novel? And I said, how funny that. So I sent her the same exact query letter again, and she took it. So it's really, somebody has to meet your writing first before they meet you most of the time. And so all the work that I put in being distracted wound up really helping me. And you heard from my bio, I do all sorts of weird things because art feeds art. So the baking, the photography, the book binding, all of that is something that keeps the creative juices flowing and makes sure that I'm not just staring at the page, deleting the 80 times in a row, which is a lot of writing, actually. Most of the time you spend writing isn't sitting at the desk typing or in your notebook writing, pen and pencil. It's walking, it is talking to people, it is sitting up in the middle of the night unable to sleep. It is so much time away from the page that, it's hard to convince yourself you're writing sometimes when you really are. So I'm always writing even though I'm not always typing. So that's kind of how that works. And people often want to know about my schedule as far as like, what does a writing day look like? Most people I find write in the morning. I do not. I am terrible in the morning. My most productive hours are from 6 to 10, which is really unfortunate for family life, but that's just how it is. I don't always write every day. I try to, but I fail a lot. So that's sort of what it is. It's when I can, as much as I can, and with a lot of forgiveness. because you hear a lot about word counts and people saying, oh, I got 5,000 words today. Ugh. Good for you. I got 2, and those 2 were quality. So, yeah, if anything that you can actually put down towards your goal is writing and it's good and you will fix it later, just get to the end any way you can. And that's kind of how I write. And they're really fast, sloppy drafts, and I write a draft, throw away 90% of it, write another draft, throw away 90% of that, until eventually I have 100% of something I don't hate entirely, and then I give it to someone else to help me fix it. So that's sort of how it works for me. Yeah.
I don't want to say too much about the ending for the people that haven't read it, but I know you said you changed the ending a couple times. Was the fate of the house something that changed, or did you?
No, the fate of the house is always the fate of the house. That's because, I mean, you can't change geology, you can't change, erosion. You can try, but it costs millions and millions of dollars and eventually will fail. So the fate of the house was what it was going to be. That is something that doesn't necessarily translate across the US. People say, well, why didn't he just save the house? I said, I could go into like a breakdown of what it is to repair a bluff. Like, do you have $1 million lying around? So it's stuff like that. The fate of the house had to be what it was. So, and I don't think that's a spoiler. Like, if you're reading closely from the beginning, So, but it was fun to write. So, yeah. Yes.
Who are some of your favorite authors?
Ooh, I love so many. It's like asking your favorite child.
Well, 3.
Yeah, okay. So my favorite author of all time only really had one book, and that was Catherine Dunn, and it was Geek Love. And I was fortunate enough that she blurbed this book, which made me cry. She was like my literary hero, and it broke my heart when she passed away this year. But Geek Love is my favorite book because it is fearless narration. I didn't know women could write that way. I didn't know women could write women that way. And it is a dark, weird, wild, dangerous little book, and you can't come away with it you can't come away from it without an opinion. I judge whether I can be friends with somebody based on their opinion of that book, and it has never steered me wrong. So I wrote her essentially a fan letter when they were trying to solicit blurbs for this book, and I said, I don't care if you blurb this book or not. I have been meaning to write you for like 20 years to tell you your book changed my life. So if you blurbed it, know that it would be a high point in the life of this book, obviously, but it would be in mine. Mm-hmm. And regardless, I should have written this 20 years ago. And then 8 weeks later, I'm crying on my living room floor because she read it, and that was beyond me. So that's my favorite book. I also really love Graham Swift's writing. He wrote Waterland, Last Orders, Ever After, a whole bunch. Waterland is my favorite of his books. It was longlisted for the Man Booker. And it was just the Booker Prize at that point. It also deals with land and erosion and history. And it changed the way I view the place of an individual story in a larger history. And I hated the first 50 pages terribly. And then all of a sudden something clicked, and I fell in love with the book, and I've never had an about face happen like that before. And that became to me the most fascinating thing to happen in literature, just how you could take something that you hate and all of a sudden it becomes something that you can't live without.
Well, did you
So-
reread those 50 pages?
Oh, yeah.
And then
No,
No,
all of a
still
sudden,
like-
all of a sudden it clicked what he was doing, and I said, "Oh, you idiot! You missed this whole thing." So I, read it through the end, and then went back through, and I recognized genius that I did not possess. So I find his sentences beautiful. I find his plots wonderful. I also very much like John Banville, and he's interesting because he writes literary fiction and then also writes mysteries under a different name, which I think helps keep writers vital. I think it helps him pull skills from either side. My favorite of his is The Sea. It's very small, and again, it's family history over time around one tragic event, so it's quite good. I tend to have favorite books, not necessarily favorite authors, because everybody changes so much from book to book. So those are 3 big ones for me. And from older works, I would say I really love The Flounder by Günter Grass. Because when you pick all of history, like all of human history as your plot, you're bold. And I found it funny, and just funny, wildly entertaining, and insightful about men and women in a way that was really ahead of its time. So as far as like early gender studies, while also being hilarious, it was a really important book for me. And
What was the title of that?
The Flounder.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, anybody else? Well, you guys have been so lovely, and thank you so much. It's been a delight talking to you. I hope you enjoyed the book. I hope you will enjoy the book. I am all over social media if you ever want to say hi. I don't bite, and I would love to talk to you again. So, thank you so much.